All right. Are the slides up?
Yes.
All right, let me make them a little larger. So you do recall, I hope, that we ended about the importance of railroads. And so I've included a couple extra slides here that you can look over, because there's going to be an essay question about the importance of railroads. And this is a little summary slide of how the railroad, some of the big changes in our society, not just economically and geographically, but you'll notice here, as far as time is concerned, before the railroad communities, our society relied on solar time, calculated by how the sun traveled. And now, with a railroad being able to go across the whole continent, the United States was divided into 4 time zones, which coincide with the sun traveling, or I guess we know nowadays, right, the Earth traveling around the sun. But some of these things here might be good. These are good main points to build a little outline in your essay question answer. It linked the East and the West. The railroads helped bring people from the East to settle the West. At the same time that the railroads were expanding and bringing people, we were still, the government, I should say that, not all Americans, but the government was still having skirmishes and wars with Native Americans. So the railroad basically was a weakening influence on the large tribes and the land that they owned. The railroads gave people more control over the environment. As more and more settlers moved west and they settled in the Great Plains, they would, if they received a farm from the Homestead Act of 1862, it was 160 acres. Other more wealthy Americans could buy up lots of land and build huge cattle ranches. And so they kind of divided up the land and they used the resources. And then something was invented called barbed wire, which was where they were able to basically fence off parts of the land, and it just, it messed, I say messed, it had an effect on the environment. You could also you could also maybe have these different points as the structure to your outline and your essay answer. The railroads had an effect geographically. They had an effect as far as population. They had an effect on government relations with Native Americans. They had an effect on the economy. The railroads had an effect on the environment. So we'll move on now because we want to go through this fairly rapidly. But if I don't get through halfway, if I don't get halfway through chapter 17 today, there's going to be a video available on the weekend. So just keep that in mind. We're still talking about industrialization, how the United States, after the Civil War and with the failure of Reconstruction, as a whole, the United States is moving from primarily an agricultural-based society to an industrial-based society. And during this time, you had big corporations or big businesses rise up. Corporations are a business that are owned by a group of investors who have invested, right? They've invested in the company because they have bought shares of stock. The New York Stock Exchange, Wall Street, was a fairly new entity at this time. And so you would have groups of people that owned the corporation. Two of the biggest big business companies dealt with oil and steel. We'll get into that here in a moment. You will often hear this time of American history, basically from about 1875 to 1900, the Gilded Age. It was a time of incredible wealth, a lot of success, but it was by the success and the wealth was really only in the hands of a few individuals and families. The rest of society was going through difficult times with struggles financially, recovering from the effects of a civil war in the South, new immigrants coming into the country, so there's more competition for jobs. And so at this time, we're really looking at a time where you basically had the rich and the poor. There really wasn't a middle class. That's not going to come until leading into the Second World War and especially after. You had the wealthy and you had the poor, and even within the wealthy, you had the super wealthy. The Gilded Age is a term that Mark Twain and Charles Warner came up with, and it to be something, for something to be gilded is when it's beautiful on the surface, maybe with gold, but underneath it, it's really cheap and worthless. And so this time of American history is called the Gilded Age because while it looked like a time of great wealth and prosperity, there was a lot of poverty underneath that. And the South remains primarily agricultural. The North and Northeast and Midwest at that time was where you found all the industries, basically. And in the South, the rise of sharecropping, and then the low prices of cotton made it hard for people to rise above the poverty level. This is how the big businesses rose to prominence. Vertical integration, which was really a process, as you can see there, where one company will basically buy up other companies or suppliers of the same type of industry. So we're going to look at a guy here in a little bit who started the Standard Oil Company, and it became the largest oil company. He would buy up smaller oil companies. So that was vertical integration. And then horizontal consolidation. I'm sorry, I got that backwards. What I described to you as horizontal consolidation. Vertical integration is not buying out other similar companies, but all of the suppliers.
Teachers, please print the option. Next Tuesday, TAG
Of that product.
Eastern State, Oklahoma State College to tour the nursing, business, and computer science department. All TAG 9 through 12 will attend. If there are any seniors not in TAG would like to attend, please see the tape. The tours will begin at 10 and conclude with lunch in the student union. The bus will leave by 9:15 and should return by 1. FCCLA popcorn money orders are due by February 3rd. The yearbook staff will be taking orders for
You
Tiger
guys don't mind if I eat a Dorito
They'll
during this
consist of
announcement, do you?
canned soda, a candy bar, and a Tiger Tail for $5. David Billy with Chalk Donation Career Development will be here on Thursday to meet with students one-on-one about assistance after high school with his department. He'll be set up in the office next to Ms. Aiken's office from 9:30 to 12:30. All Choctaw students need to stop by to visit him.
Okay, I'm going to go on
He has some good information about college and trade school and can
2 of the big
career development applications
barons
that day. The junior class will
of
be
business
having
during
a
this
meeting
time.
tomorrow at Second Breakfast. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
Andrew Carnegie. He made a fortune as a steel producer. Carnegie Steel. The Carnegie Steel Company eventually became a company with 20,000 employees and became the largest industrial company in the world at the time. John D. Rockefeller was the one who started the Standard Oil Company, formed in 1870. And by 1879, Standard Oil Company controlled 90% of oil refining in the United States. Now, you might want to write this down. I believe it's in your textbook. But this is a good, you'll have a section on your test where you will match the description with the term. And so, or you'll have multiple choice question where there'll be a question and you have 4 choices. And so this is one of a perfect fact that would fit into that kind of testing. But the first oil well, now you guys live in eastern Oklahoma and you see more gas wells, but if you go west into central Oklahoma and western Oklahoma, mostly oil wells. The first oil well in the United States was drilled in 1859 in Titusville, Pennsylvania. Now, I'm assuming they still make high school students in Oklahoma take Oklahoma history. So anybody remember where the first oil well in Oklahoma was drilled? Anybody? Anybody? Bueller? Fry? So, huh? Anybody want to guess the general area of the state?
Johnston County.
What county?
Johnson?
Johnson County?
Yes.
Where is that? Because I haven't taken Oklahoma history in years. I'm not up on all the counties.
Oh, let me look it up again.
Would it be closer to Tulsa or Oklahoma City?
Tulsa.
There you go. So the first oil well drilled in Oklahoma, I believe the family's last name was Glenn. And so they drilled it and they named it the Glen. Anybody? Anybody? Not well. There's not a Glenwell, Oklahoma. Not the Glen oil rig. There's not a Glen oil rig. Something else that liquid can do when it comes out of the ground. It comes out and it lands and it starts to
Spew.
well, not when it's spewing, but when it lands on the ground.
Glencoe.
Huh?
Glencoe.
Not Glencoe. It
Glenpool.
pool, yeah, it pools.
There's a, oh yeah, there is.
So Glenpool, Oklahoma is where the first oil well in Oklahoma was. All right, we wasted too much time on that. Let's go to the next guy. J.P. Morgan. This guy was a business tycoon deluxe. He was born into wealth, so he was, as we would say, born with a silver spoon. His family, they started doing what's called investment banking. And eventually, they bought out Carnegie Steel in 1901 and formed the U.S. Steel Corporation. Eventually had 168,000 employees. They were the first billion-dollar corporation. So these are the business tycoons. Sometimes they're called the I don't know that I've got these in the right order. Goodness. Captains of industry. These were guys that would be, if they had a Shark Tank show back then, these would be the guys who you'd go before. And these were the sharks, the entrepreneurs. Now, some people called them robber barons instead of captains of industry because they were getting fat and rich, and they were doing it on the backs of common people. But anyway, these men, and they mostly were men, gave away millions and millions of dollars. They were those who believed that that they didn't make all this wealth just to keep it for themselves. They were big-time philanthropists. You can see here that Carnegie gave away $350 million in his life. We're talking in the late 1800s, early 1900s. I think our textbook had it up to 400 million. So he gave away a lot of money, even by today's standards. Rockefeller did the same thing. His mom was a Baptist, and he gave a lot of money to Baptist churches, and they gave money to to communities to build public libraries and things like that. So they use their wealth to benefit the country, although they controlled how it was used, right? They didn't just give every American $50,000 or whatever. You know, we have a Democratic candidate who's promised to give every adult in America, I think it was $1 million a month. I don't know how he could do that, but
It was 1,000.
1,000, thank you. I thought that sounded kind of high. So we'll talk more about the relationship between these barons and the government in a little bit. The next thing we want to look at is this is a section in your book called Organized Labor. I also refer to it as labor conflict, because you have the wealthy and the poor. You have these few that are the super wealthy getting super rich, getting the majority of the profits, and those that work for them are not really lifting themselves up economically. In the 1800s, you had factory workers usually working 12-hour days, 6 days a week. If you worked for a steel mill, you usually worked 7 days a week. Back then, you did not have 2 weeks vacation if you started working at one of these places. You did not have any sick leave. I've been in the church sector for so long. I'm not sure if you were to start a new job today in a company like this. I'm thinking that people might start out with 5 days of sick leave a year, but I'm not sure. There was no compensation if you lost your job, no unemployment to supplement you until you got a new job. There was no workers' compensation. If you got hurt working at a steel mill, that's just your bad fortune. You got to pay for your own doctor's visit, your own surgery, your own medicine. No compensation from your job. You also had children. You had children working. And sometimes they were as young as 5 years old, working 12 to 14 hours a day for a little bit more than a quarter a day. So think about that. You work 6 days a week, maybe 7, and you're going to get somewhere between $1.50 and $1.75 for for 1 week of work. So in the midst of this, the super wealthy are getting wealthier. The poor are not really changing at all. They're just working and existing. You had labor unions start to form. These would be groups of workers working together, finding, as you can see here, strength in numbers to get better working conditions, better pay. Here's another first you'll want to know. The first labor union was a group called the Knights of Labor. And they were formed I'm sorry, that's not the first one. The first one was the National Labor Union. 1866. That is in your textbook. I should have looked more closely at my slide. This was the first union, the Knights of Labor, to accept workers of any race or gender. The National Labor Union of 1866, can you guess who the only workers were that could join that?
White,
White males, yeah.
yeah, figures.
And you can see that the Knights of Labor, they worked hard to get an 8-hour workday instead of 12 or 14. And they were really ahead of their time. They wanted equal pay for women. And they accepted not only men and women, or not only whites or blacks or Native Americans or Chinese, but they also said, you can join our union whether you are a skilled worker, that is, if you had some kind of a craft or a trade, or if you were just an unskilled employee, a factory worker working on the assembly line. Either of them could join. Other unions arose, like the American Federation of Labor. They were a more selective group. You had to be a white male, and you had to be someone who had a craft or a trade. Carpenters, plumbers, excuse me, anyone with a specific craft, this was a union for them. Assembly line workers could not work or not join this labor federation. But this is what they did. This is what the labor unions did. They worked to get more, to get better wages, to get benefits, and to have shorter work days. Now, we still have unions today, and this is something that you want to understand about the rise of unions and big businesses during this time. What was happening here, as we see in a little bit, the government starts to get involved, was the unions wanted to take an American ideal that all people are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And all people had rights. The Bill of Rights were the rights that all people had, and our Constitution protected those rights. And so the labor unions were simply taking those principles of American democracy and applying them to business. So just as we did not want a king ruling over our country, instead we had a democratic Republican government, big businesses should not be allowed to operate where you have the owner and a few board members getting filthy rich while everybody who works for them is dirt poor. There needs to be more equality in the workplace, is what these unions were talking about. So the principle of democracy and equality is what was coming into the business world here. And that's what labor unions were fighting for. But there were some things that set them back. If workers at certain companies were not getting the pay that they thought they deserved, or they were required to work too many hours, they would go on strikes. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 was a protest because their wages had been cut. And many were, excuse me, many workers went on strike to protest. And eventually it got so bad that violence broke out and the president had to send in federal troops. While these workers were striking, the companies would hire replacement workers called scabs, and they would do the work while the people were striking. You still hear that term today. In 1987, the NFL, this is a good time to share this since the Super Bowl is coming up on Sunday. In 1987, the football players in the NFL went on strike. And for about 4 weeks, football teams were hiring all these former college players who didn't make the NFL, or anybody who tried out to play football. And you had the scabs playing for 4 weeks. And because the NFL wanted the season to go on. And finally, they were able to work things out. But just a time of terrible football. Anyway, you can see here that the federal government, when these types of things happened, strikes and riots, the government usually sided with the big business. Because one of the reasons why, the big business owners, the barons, the tycoons, they could use their money to influence politicians, right? There's nothing new under the sun is a popular saying from the Old Testament. Today, we hear candidates running for president talking about, well, we're going to put a limit on lobbying spending. We don't want groups trying to buy the presidency or buy their policies. But this has been going on for a long time. People with money and influence try to earn favors or get favors and get legislation passed that is helpful to them by using their money. Some other setbacks, the Haymarket riot in 1886 in Chicago. This was where some of the police were killed by a bomb. And this gave, in the public eye in America, this gave unions a bad image because they were looked upon as radical and violent people. A couple more strikes that are in your textbook. You know, the railroad strike was not a good thing because remember how important railroads were. The Homestead strike was a steel plant strike. So we're going to stop there because our time's up. Any questions?
Are you gonna have the slides up like after they get everything fixed, or?
Yes, I'm going to put these up after class. So you'll need to go over them because I didn't cover everything. I will also add some more slides for the first half of chapter 17. And there will be a video up for the weekend about the rest of the slides and the beginning of chapter 17. So yes.
Okay, thank you.
Have a great weekend. We'll see you Monday morning.